Hello and welcome to the Educators Going Global podcast. In this episode, we interview international teacher transition consultant Jacqueline Mallais, who joined us from Guadalajara, Mexico. Check the show notes for Jacqueline's bio, and Jacqueline shares information about her services at the end of the episode. Jacqueline has such a depth of knowledge about the international teacher job transition process. As with our other encounters with her, we learned a lot. In this episode, we covered the topics of what happens after you sign the contract with your new school. Jacqueline shares insights on who you will be hearing from, what type of information will be shared, what early orientation can look like, and lots more. These tips will help you prepare to take the leap of faith into teaching overseas. This interview was recorded on October 18th, 2022. And now we give you Jacqueline Mallais.
Hi again, Jacqueline. How are things in Guadalajara as you head into Day of the Dead celebrations?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's exciting. You get to see Halloween stuff coming up. Getting the change of the season for Guadalajara is not what I'm used to in Canada. There aren't the changing of colors or leaves dropping, anything like that. But what you start to see are skeletons start showing up in people's front doors and front yards, and it's exciting knowing that Day of the Dead is November 2nd and the night before, to avoid all cemeteries because that's where the parties happen.
Avoid the parties, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, because they're kind of personal, they're friends and family that are attending their gravesite with the favorite food and the favorite beverages of choice, and then so they present and then they eat and drink and be merry in a cemetery to honor the dead.
Oh, so avoid because it's really a family thing and you would be intruding, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I feel
Okay.
like, me as a foreigner walking along and taking
Mhm.
photos might be a little disturbing.
Just a little inappropriate. Okay. So have you got a going global story for us this morning?
Well, I was thinking about the time when, as a result of not being super prepared my first time overseas and just learning the day before that I was moving to Korea. So I had no idea what the food tasted like. I had no idea of the language. So in my second time heading overseas, I had a 6-month window to know that I was moving to Istanbul. And so what I started to do was I changed some of my taste buds, but I also started taking Turkish lessons. And I dove right in because Turkish was my fifth language.
Wow.
And so I just decided I'm going to start taking some serious Turkish lessons twice a week, a couple of hours each time. And in that 6 months, I got the equivalency of about a year's worth of Turkish. But a funny thing happened when I arrived in Turkey. I think it was my second day. I was in Istanbul and I was taking a taxi and I was speaking to the man in Turkish, the taxi driver. And, inevitably the question comes up, how long have you been here? And I said 2 days. And he almost had an accident. Like he almost ran into the guy in front of us because he just said, "What?" He thought I had learned Turkish in 2 days. And oh, no, 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 you don't understand. I took 6 months of this language before moving here. I learned it before coming. And he was like, oh, okay. I thought, wow, she must be a genius to have learned this in 2 days. So yeah, the importance of getting your feet on the ground and running as soon as you land, and knowing a little bit about the language. I'm not saying you're going to get fluent before you leave, but for sure, if you have the opportunity to learn the language before moving, I would highly recommend it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. When I was going to move to Chile, I started learning Spanish, and there are a lot of good apps and podcasts that you can use. So there's a great app called Duolingo that a lot of people use.
Mm-hmm.
And
I
then,
use it every day. I'm on a 530-day
atta
streak.
girl.
Oh my.
And then I also listened to something called Coffee Break, which I highly recommend. I don't know if they're going to have all the target languages that you're looking for, but they do have a lot of languages. And the idea is it's about a 15, 20-minute little segment that you could do during your coffee break. And so I started with coffee break Spanish. I would do that on my walk to and from school and just, fit it in between. And so I highly recommend that as well, that tip of trying to learn a bit of the language, because people really appreciate it when you get there, don't they?
Oh, definitely. And I'm going to join in, and I'm also studying Spanish using, I think it's pronounced memorize, like memorize. It's kind of a card-based app. Another avenue is YouTube. That's another
Mm-hmm.
place where I'm learning Spanish as well. So it's just a great idea, a great tip to go in and be a global nomad, someone who's very engaged from the get-go in your new culture. So excellent idea for folks to think about.
And if you're more of an in-person, because that's how I am for language learning, I need to be with the person in the same room. What I did was I happened to be in Ottawa at the time, so I contacted the Turkish embassy and said, do you have any recommendations for a Turkish teacher in the Ottawa area? And they happened to have a teacher who taught the Turkish diplomats' children on Saturdays their own language because they were worried about the children losing their Turkish in the years that they were living in Canada. So this lady was a professional teacher of Turkish, and so that's why I signed up with her and then just paid her privately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've done that too. I agree. And although I have to tell a quick story here. In Ethiopia, we had a teacher and he was very rote and he wanted us to learn the characters, and they have 120 characters or something like that. And, he wanted us to learn the sounds. And so I'll never forget, one of the first things he taught us was Leila Leba Bush Sulabala Shushu, which means because another thief ate a cork, he ran away. And I'm like, that is not helpful. That is not going to help me integrate into society. So you have to be also a little judicious in, the teacher that you get. Be picky.
But look at how you've remembered it for these many years.
All right, well, before we jump right in and get into the guiding question, I just want to remind our listeners that Jacqueline is a frequent guest, and we're at the point where we've covered with Jacqueline how to prepare to recruit, and then once you're recruiting, what it looks like. So what we're going to move into now is kind of the next stage. So our guiding question is, so you've signed the contract for your new school, what happens next?
So, our first question is, what kind of information and how frequent would we expect the communication to be from the new school once you've signed the contract?
Yeah, so you've received your offer in the email, and typically they give you a couple of days to think about it. They might stretch to a week if you request the time to think about it, and then you've signed it, you've sent it back via email, and then typically you would get an email that they've received it and that congratulating you and welcoming you, being very happy that you've decided to join them. And then you might hear crickets. You might not hear anything for a while because they'll have so many other jobs that they're still interviewing for, that there are so many candidates that they're still contacting, that if the head of school or the head of HR writes you and says, we'll get in touch with you in the coming weeks or in the next week, it might not happen. And don't panic. Don't think, my gosh, I've just lost my job. This is completely normal. It's a very packed hiring season, especially in the fall to, I would say, January, February. So if you're in the October to January, let's say, hiring frenzy, you might not hear a lot. And I would say if it has gone a couple weeks, then definitely, reach out to them and just say, hey, I'm just reaching out. I'm wondering if I can get in contact with somebody at the school, maybe the person that is leaving the position or somebody in the department. And that's completely fine to ask for a contact. Then you can reach out and feel that sort of connection with the new school.
And I think something else that might be happening is that they're gathering their list of newbie hires because they like to send out sort of all the information at one time. So they might be just hanging on until they get that, that last hire, or at least a critical mass of new hires. And then they send out, blanket information to the whole group at once, because that's been my experience in a lot of schools too.
Yeah, I feel that that's probably also what's happening is if they have 10 or 12 openings, which could be, very normal, could be the case for a larger school. As you say, they don't want to trickle out the information and then sort of lose track of who has had what. So yeah, that's a very good point.
Yes. So they're past the frenzy and they're settling down and moving to the next stage. Who might you hear from?
So at some point, you might hear from, they're different terms, but they might say something like a new teacher orientation coordinator, or so someone who's on staff, could be a teacher, it could be a parent. I'm thinking the parent volunteer coordinator, who might work for the school or might be a voluntary position, but you might hear from somebody who represents the school but is going to connect with all the new teachers and then orient them in the weeks leading up to arriving, and maybe months even. It might start even sooner, like 6 months before you arrive.
So I have to tell a quick little story about that. When I first went to Ethiopia 30 years ago, I received a letter because at the time there was no email. I received a letter from the French teacher that I was replacing, and I found out later that he was a little bit unhappy at the school. But his letter basically said, "This is going to be challenging. There's no resources," because I had written and asked him what the textbook was just to get a start, and he said that the textbook is called Son et Sens. And he didn't tell me who the publisher was, and then he said courage, which basically means good luck, you sucker, kind of thing. And it was a little disconcerting. It was my first time overseas. I had no clue. Thank goodness, not that long afterwards, this wonderful woman, Amy, was the head of English, and she wrote to everyone this big, long letter and said, here's what you can and cannot get here. Here are some things to expect. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amy. You're a wonderful star. But boy, the first guy just really freaked me out.
Yeah, and these days with technology, it makes a lot of sense for schools to do something. I've been at schools where they create a Facebook group, and then all the questions that everyone has, they can be posed in that forum so that you're not repeating the information, and it's not an email frenzy back and forth between the coordinator or, let's say, the head of HR, because in some cases there might not be a coordinator, it might be somebody in HR answering all these questions. And then if it's in a group or WhatsApp or something like that where everyone else gets to see the answers, then they don't ask that themselves.
And then what's nice about a WhatsApp group, for example, is then the newbies can continue to use that as a way to get together once you get in country.
Yes. So let's unpack it just a touch more, that what kind of information you should hopefully expect from the different people, from HR to your division principal, whether you're like elementary, you're the team lead. And another person besides the kind of teacher coordinator is hopefully you get a buddy, right? The idea that you've got someone who's really going to be that person you can maybe get the inside scoop. And if you could also speak, it's almost like etiquette. There's certain things you don't want to email that very busy principal about. So if you can cover that as well.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it. The buddy might be somebody that the school has said to the staff at large, would anyone like to onboard or take on this position to answer some questions? And then it might be somebody from your department. It might be somebody in a similar marital situation, like a young single person with a young single person, so that you can talk about what do you do after school, and what do you do on weekends, or a family guy with a family guy, or so I know that some schools have quite a large intake of staff, and so then they might be able to personalize that buddy. And in some cases it might be such a small intake, you're maybe one of 2 or 3 new teachers coming to a school, and so you're matched with just someone randomly and has nothing in common with you. But I would still say don't shy away from asking all the hard questions. You've brought up a good point about not keeping in mind that you're very busy, they're very busy, and definitely the principals are going to be super busy still in that hiring position. And then once the hiring is done, they've still got a full-time job. So You don't want to be that voice that's constantly ringing out to the principal asking a lot of questions, where you can be asking that to your buddy. And then if the school doesn't actually assign somebody to you, I would just speak up and just say, is there someone on staff that I could email my couple questions about moving to this area? And then they take it from there.
Yeah, I think that's really good. You do have to advocate for yourself somewhat. It's true. So, what about the onboarding process where the school helps you with things that you're going to need to live in the country, which I know doesn't always happen depending on how the school is set up, but things like a work visa, maybe tickets, things like setting up bank account, things like that. What are some things to expect with that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these things will get worked out once you arrive, but before you arrive, for sure, the work visa and everything to do with getting into the country. So, for example, the flights are often booked by the HR. They'll confirm your hometown as far as in July or August when you'll be flying. Are you going to be flying out of this airport? If you have a specific change to that, just be careful, because it should be in your contract that you fly out of and return to the same town each year. And the reason schools do that is just a cost thing. And that's why I recommend, if you come from a small town, you put that small town down. You don't assume the biggest city, like Chicago is my hometown, but actually it's Boise, Idaho or something, because then you're never going to get that Chicago to Boise part of your journey paid for. So always pick the small hometown and say, that's my hometown and that's where I need to return. And then they'll be sure to get the airport that's closest to you. So flights are booked by HR, but then also the whole visa, making sure you've got a passport that's more than 6 months, because a lot of countries won't allow you into the country if the passport will expire in 6 months. And it's going to be a big hassle to get your visa and everything if your passport's about to expire. So making sure that that's ready to go. And then just know that a lot of times you're going to be spending money for this onboarding, the visa or DHL costs of shipping documents back and forth, maybe even getting a medical ahead of time, but keep every receipt. And I would recommend, I just always had one purple folder and I put all my receipts in that. And I always had that in my carry-on. And when I got to the school, it's not day 2, you say, hi, here are my receipts. You might wait a couple weeks because HR is pretty busy at the beginning of the year, but eventually a good HR might say, hey, give me all your receipts. They might actually ask all the teachers to make an appointment with them or something, and then they would sit down with their receipts. But at some point, yes, in the first month, you can expect reimbursement. If a school doesn't offer reimbursement, please ask, because that should be part of their costs, not yours.
Good tip.
And that work visa is such a big thing. We had a wonderful couple on, and we're talking about college transcript, grad school transcript, a medical record, all this. And then I guess it's been a while since I've done this, but then they have to get notarized and things like that. So it's a big process, and like you're saying, have a central place for it. And one thing that they brought up was, I think they were saying they got double of everything. So there was the one group that, you're right, was sent out air package, overnight kind of delivery. So they were sure it was getting to the HR. But then I think they were saying they brought copies with them, so they were ready to roll if anything had happened, or they just needed it if they were going to the embassy. So that was another big tip.
Yeah, it's daunting, but it's doable. Just know that for any new listener, new teachers out there, you're not alone. Everyone has gone through this, and any obstacle can be overcome. And it will be your HR. What's funny is your first local friends at the new school are usually the HR department. Am I right? Like you show up and you bring them a gift from your country because you feel like you know them so well after the 6 to 8 months of onboarding. You're like, I just need to get Diana something from my country to thank her for all this hard work.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And one thing I want to add, Audrey, you were pointing this out. If you're not getting some of these follow-ups and requests from your new school, what you might do is go to some of the Facebook groups and just put on there, what are people hearing from their school? What should I expect? And to the point of advocating for yourself, because it's almost making a checklist. And if certain things are not happening, then you can reach out, in a very kind way and say, could you tell me more about what I need to be doing to bring my dog in? I haven't heard about how I'm supposed to do that. So that taking care of yourself and just being very proactive is important.
Well, you've brought up a good point about Facebook groups. They're a wealth of knowledge that you could ask the groups in the new country. You could ask them a lot of the questions and save the teacher from having to answer. If it's something country related or city related as opposed to school related, you could save a lot of your new friends' time by asking there, can I get size 8 shoes, is a question you could ask the Facebook group as opposed to asking the new buddy teacher.
So we're going to do a whole separate show on once you land in your new country. So folks, just be ready for that. And we're also going to cover the transition of going through the emotions, saying goodbye to people. That really begins that process of loss and grieving where you're leaving and then coming to your new place and getting acclimated to it. So we're definitely going to cover that. But I'm just wondering if you can just do a kind of a brief snapshot of what orientation should include, because a lot of orientation now is happening before you get there. So can we shift to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think you've brought up a good point about the emotional side of things. I'm a very logistical person, and so I appreciate when a school reaches out to me and gives me something like a PDF booklet. I'm actually looking at one of the examples because I like to keep things. So I have an example of a PDF booklet that I received from my school here in Mexico. And if they send this to you ahead of time, a few months in advance, it gives you a chance to start to get your bearing before you even arrive in the country. Things like what to expect with health and safety, finances, transportation, shopping, where can you look for things, what can you buy, how to make phone calls, getting your SIM card. And then some language basics. They might even include a page or two, or in this case here, 5 pages of what to say and how to say it, and then maps. So I think if a school can send that out to new teachers before they arrive, it gives them some time to look it over, to gather some more questions and think about how are they going to make that move.
Yeah, I think that can be really helpful. Sometimes they raise issues that you didn't even think about. And so anything that the school can do, because they've, gone through it multiple times, and hopefully they've gotten feedback from previous newbies on, what helped a lot and what things would have been helpful that weren't done and so on. And so they've got a kind of a database of different concerns teachers might have and different aspects of living in the new location that would be helpful. And I think to your point that just a few helpful phrases in the language is such a nice thing to have. So hopefully the HR department of the school you're going to is going to put out something along those lines. So what are some to-dos that you can think of, back to your point of being super logistically inclined regarding household store, like storing your stuff in the States or Canada or whatever your home country, things like getting your mail stopped or forwarded or what have you, pets, setting up communication tools to the new place, maybe anything to do with finances that you should take care of before you leave. What about those logistical pieces?
Yeah, I mean, shipping your items, shipping your household goods. Some people are very unattached to things and they show up with 2 suitcases. And other people show up like myself with 54 boxes. And so there might be a happy medium in there somewhere. I did move overseas with 10 boxes. So I started this whole career with 10 boxes. I've grown to 54. So that's why Mexico is my last stop. I can't afford to move again. But the shipping is something again, that HR will likely touch upon. If it's not your first move overseas, or if you want to move your entire household, you can reach out to them for requests or for recommendations of shipping companies, knowing that the shipping company in the destination and the shipping company in the exporting fashion, wherever you are, might be different, but they talk to each other, like they work together. Some schools will offer shipping as part of their package, and then others will not, and they will just cover 2 suitcases or the cost of maybe an extra suitcase or something like that. So a lot of teachers will have to sort of dig into their foreign benefits package to see what exactly is paid for. But what are some necessary items? I would say definitely a set of sheets for when you arrive, a towel for when you arrive. I know that when I always had that in my suitcase, and then something that might make your new place feel like home. I always brought wall hanging in every one of my places. I always put up that wall hanging, and then that just made it feel a little bit more homey. And then when your things arrive, or if you have other items that are coming later, then that's makes it more like a home. You're talking about SIM cards and finances. That all gets taken care of once you arrive. I don't know that you can prepare too much for that. But you mentioned mail. I don't know if the listeners are coming from home and they're actually have a home and they're going to be renting it out. But that's things to consider: forwarding your mail to a family member, for example, who could then stockpile it and then send it to you or bring it with them when they're visiting. But it's so hard to say there's a one answer for every situation, because every situation, there's so many of them.
Yeah, that's very true.
One thing, and I should give them the kudos, Mel and Cole, that we did an interview with them. It's their first year overseas, and they had a second very helpful point. So just think of when you are logging on to your bank account now in today's world, and if you've got two-factor authentication going on, it's going to send a text to your phone wherever you are. And that's just something that you've got to figure out, how are you going to do that to set it up that they can, and maybe instead of sending an SMS, that they send you an email, as an example. And they also brought up the point of using your North American based credit card. And this is something I think a lot of us have learned in our travels. You let them know that you're going to travel, but also that is something that sometimes has two-factor authentication involved with it too. And you've moved to a new country and you've got a new phone number, so that might not work. But that's something to think a little bit about. How are you going to transition till you get to the new country and you get your new bank and you get your new local credit card, or that you might just continue to use your potentially North American based credit card. And I would say make sure you get the one that you don't have to pay a fee every time you do a transaction. So I thought that was really helpful information.
Yeah, 20 years, I've always tried to keep my phone number, because oftentimes they won't allow an overseas phone number. At least with the Canadian banks I've dealt with, they have a limit of numbers. I think it's, what is it? 3 and 7 is 10, 11. Yeah, it's an 11-digit number is what they allow. And oftentimes an overseas number is a lot longer. So I've used a trusted family member's phone number, and then I can actually call that person or email them or text them and say, hey, you're about to get a code. Can you send it to me? And, depending on the time zone, of course, that can work out well. But as you said, talking to your bank ahead of time and saying, I'm going to be traveling overseas, heading to this place, please don't block my account. You'll see a number of charges. I bought a treadmill once, or attempted to buy a treadmill in Istanbul, and it was blocked because it was such a big amount. And they thought, wow, this has got to be something corrupt or fake, and so I couldn't purchase the treadmill when I wanted to, and I had to quickly call the bank. But of course, with the time zones, the bank was closed, and so I had to wait until the next day. So it's always good if you can preempt that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a great idea.
I thought I'd throw in a little pointer here, and I don't know how relevant this will be. It might have been just in this country I was in, but in Chile, when we were just newly arrived, I went to IKEA. And I don't know if anybody's been to IKEA, but boy, you go round and round, and it's this whole rabbit warren maze thing. And you don't actually take all the products, you take the little tag or whatever, and you get to the checkout. We were almost 2 hours there. I get to the checkout and they said, oh, you can't use your American card unless you have your passport to prove who you are. And I didn't have my passport with me. So it was like, okay, I guess I have to just leave all this stuff. and come back
Oh,
another
man.
time. And it was just heartbreaking after putting in all that time. So just a thought, maybe have your passport with you for the first couple days till you get your
That's
local bank
definitely an
card.
inside scoop.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Mm.
And getting cash. What I do before I arrive in the country is I get a certain amount of US dollars as well, because that often is the international currency. But I also try and get the local currency before I leave and before I get on the plane. And then some schools will actually
Oh,
give you
yeah.
an envelope filled with cash. And that's fantastic when they do that. When they meet you at the airport and they say, here's a bundle of cash to help you settle in, it's so easy then, but don't presume that that's going to happen. It's always better to have your
That
own
makes a lot of
stash.
Hmm.
sense. Well, Audrey, I don't want to catch you flat footed, but I'm wondering, we can't generalize. If you want to talk about pets a little bit and just maybe one experience or two experiences in how to get your pet from A to B, how has that worked out?
Well, so I intentionally bought a dog that can go under the seat on the plane because it just simplifies things a ton. If you were crating an animal, it's a whole different process and it's very expensive and, of course, stressful on the animal. And, sometimes you have to leave them with someone because you can't get permission to bring them in. So you have to leave them with a friend for a while. And then when they arrive, they have to be quarantined. So it is a whole huge, long process. Sometimes you have to hire an expediter that specifically does pets. But with the pet that goes under the seat, typically you just have to pay a smallish amount for a ticket, maybe $200 in that range. And then usually what the country, when you arrive, what they want to see is documentation showing that they've had their rabies vaccination. Out of 3 countries where our dog has lived, which is Italy, Senegal, and now Jamaica, Jamaica was by far the most complicated because they don't have rabies here. And so they have this whole process where you have to get an actual rabies test, which is very hard to do because there's only one lab in the US that processes
Oh.
these tests. So it takes a long time. Basically, the process for importing an animal into, or a dog anyways, into Jamaica is a 3-month process. So just something to keep in mind, that start
Mm-hmm.
looking into it early because it can take a lot of time.
I had a dog in Istanbul, and I would crate her. So she would travel. There were just some specific airlines I would use. KLM was an excellent one because they have a pet hotel in Amsterdam.
Mm.
So halfway through the journey, they would take her out, walk her around, let her use the facilities, and then put her back in with some fresh water and food that you would tape to the outside of the crate. But the paperwork was always, as you say, not only the proof that the rabies vaccine was done every year, but also in some cases the proof that it took. So that's a blood test, as you say. It's a serious lab cost, and to try and find one in the country where you happen to be leaving, like I was leaving Istanbul, moving to Oman, and having to do that in Turkish, trying to find this lab that would do the blood test for my dog. It was an undertaking, but it's our family members, and so
Hmm.
we happily do it to have them accompany us.
And it's all part of the adventure of traveling, is trying to do those things that are sometimes a challenge.
So, kind of shifting a little bit into what our future episode will be, making that emotional and social transition. And as a counselor, I always say to my parents who are leaving my school to begin the process of getting your children and yourselves familiar with where you're going. And clearly, with all the technology, you can begin to do that and you can help build up the excitement, but at the same time, help your children and help yourself begin the process of saying goodbye to where you are. So, with that premise, what can people do to connect to the new school, the community, and the local culture before they arrive?
Yeah, I've just started to discover YouTube vloggers that are expats in the country. So here in Mexico, there's a number of vloggers I follow. And even though I'm already in the country and have been here for a little over a year, it's so fascinating to see what they're discovering. And then it makes me excited to travel around Mexico. So I would suggest to listeners, look up vloggers on YouTube and see if there are any expat vloggers that have done what you're about to do, move to the new country, settle in, walking to the markets. So you can start to already get a feel for the destination where you're going to be moving to.
Yeah, I found a good one on moving to Jamaica that was similar.
Oh. And I would add to that the bloggers. And as a longtime blogger myself, there are plenty of folks out there, and they've made a business out of it. It's a way they make a living. And you can also go at it from just the vacation part of it too. You're going to that new country. What are the first places you're going to travel to? That's another way to build that excitement, especially for your children, and helping them make that transition.
Yeah, I might recommend waiting until you get to country
Oh,
before
yeah.
you start
Yeah.
booking your flights. But it's always fun to look at the calendar and start imagining, hey, we have a long weekend in October. Where are we going to go? But maybe just wait until you're in country to start booking those local flights. But definitely start doing some research. And with a family, in mind, you might be thinking, what are we going to do for Christmas?
Oh, yeah.
Start discussing even that ahead of time. Are we going to stay local? Are we going to go head home? In some cases, for me, I didn't have Christmases off in one particular country. And so we would have the day off, December 25th, but we were working on the 24th. We were working on the 26th. So I knew that my next country, I wanted to have that time. And I was very excited to have those two. In fact, the school I moved to had 3 weeks off at Christmas. So I knew that I was very excited to go home for the first Christmas. So things like that to look forward to.
But also, just a word of caution that sometimes you can't leave the country for a certain amount of time. So, when we moved to Italy, because it's part of Schengen, until you have your work visa, which Italy is notoriously red tapey in their government. And so things take a long time to process. And so even though we had started the process before we left the States, there was question about whether, so for the first 3 months, if you left the country, you may not be able to get back in. So it can be tricky. So just be sure that you ask about that.
Yeah, and passports might not even be in your possession for the first 3 to 4
That's
months
a good
because
point.
of that work visa.
That's a good point.
Yeah. I like that adjective, Audrey, red tapey.
Yes.
I think we know a number of countries that fall under red tapiness.
Well, Audrey, I thought you were going to go in the direction, and this would be a Stephen Bush question. Let's say you're leaving Canada or the U.S., and you're going overseas for that first year, and you want to set yourself up for the tax exemption. And I'm not going to put either of you on the spot to answer this, but if you were to fly back to the U.S. for a couple of weeks and then come back to your country, does that make it more difficult to get that exemption the first year? I can't remember how that works.
Well, you got to get
Yeah,
Stephen
we'll have
back
to ask
on.
him that one. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the fact that Canadians can declare non-residency, but there's nothing to actually fill out or nothing to do. It's just a declaration that I'm now a non-resident from this point onwards, and then I don't pay taxes on my world income. But Americans, I know that they have, like you say, an exemption to a certain amount. Isn't that right?
Up to
Yeah,
a
but
certain
teachers
amount.
are never going to make that amount. This year it's $112,000. So teachers,
You have a
really, in most places, there's a very rare place where a teacher would make that.
Exactly.
So, and that doesn't include housing.
Oh, I didn't know that either. Jeez.
Not including housing.
Quick question to you, Canadians there. Once you leave, do you have to stay out of the country a certain amount of time to be able to keep that not paying taxes? How does that work?
Yeah, 6 months. 6 months. In fact, I was at home for almost 6 months, and I calculated there's a Google, you can just Google what is 6 months in days, and then it'll tell you a date. And I knew I needed to leave for Mexico before that date, or else I was going to be flipping the switch and being considered a resident. So yeah, if you stay 6 months and 1 day in Canada in a calendar year, you will be considered a resident.
And then another thing along that line is back in the day, when you became a non-resident, you lost the right to vote, but that changed just in the last few years. So as a Canadian, I was able to vote in the last election, which was super exciting.
Yeah, I've only voted a few times in the 20 years I've been overseas because it's really hard to get the ballots. Sometimes, they won't DHL or FedEx them, and then just using the regular post office is not possible in some countries.
Yeah, it's expensive too, like just to get either to get the ballot or to send it or both. So it is, you really have to be committed to getting your vote.
Well, I
That is
can
for
add
sure.
a quick American aspect as the outsider here in this discussion, even though Audrey, you're U.S. now. So with the U.S., you can sign up ahead of time, and they will send you via email, and then you download print the ballot and the envelope, and then whether you're at a consulate city or an embassy city, you can take it to the either and just drop it off, and that saves the mailing cost. So that's very helpful.
That's the difference between a country with 300 million people and 30 million, because you guys have thought of everything. Absolutely wonderful. And I also, I mean, not to be political, but I also think, Australia with its mandatory voting would be very interesting for Aussies overseas. How do they deal with that? Because they can actually get, I don't know, fined or something if they don't vote in an election.
I'm sure that their consulate takes care of that for them, helps them out with that. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll have to ask my Aussie neighbors who live across the street. We'll get back to you on that, guys.
Well, Jacqueline, our listeners are very familiar with you at this point, but it's still always great that they can hear, and we'll put in the show notes, how can people learn more about you and your services?
Yeah, so I'm an international teacher consultant that helps new and veteran teachers with their CV edits and cover letter or letters of introduction edits. And then I do a video call, sometimes before, sometimes after, sometimes both, to touch base with my clients and get to know what their wishes are. Where do they want to go? I give them advice. And then from that point onwards, I email them. They might email me. In fact, I've got a couple of clients' emails waiting in my inbox saying, I've heard about this school. What have you heard? And so because I have such a vast network of friends and former colleagues living and working all over the world, I can reach out to them and ask them boots on the ground kind of thing. What have you heard about this school before accepting a position? So my website is jpmintconsulting.com. So my initials, JPM, int for international, consulting.com. And there I've posted a number of blog articles and job search tips that are free. People can just access them. If they're thinking of making this move overseas, I started writing the articles thinking, what would I want to know about this best kept secret, as a lot of us call it, best kept secret about teaching overseas? What would I want to know? And if ever someone has more questions and wants to know more than what I've written there, please get in touch with me, jpmintconsulting@gmail.com.
Perfect. Well, once again, very enjoyable chatting with you. We gained a lot of information. I hope that people are going to find helpful. And thanks again for taking the time, Jacqueline.
Well, thank you for having me. I always look forward to these mornings with barking dogs in the background, notwithstanding.
Awesome.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
and David,
inviting you to travel,
teach,
and connect with us.